This is Steve with Rocky Mountain ATV MC, and today I'm going to show you how to rebuild the top end on a Honda TRX400EX. There are plenty of reasons for you to have to rebuild the top end on your ATV, whether it's excessive noise, loss of compression, it's locked up, or maybe you just want to freshen it up before the season. So today I'm going to show you how to do that on this '99 Honda TRX400EX. Now these procedures that I show you will be very similar on all TRX400EXs, but you need to check with your OEM service manual to be sure. To do this job, you're going to need some basic hand tools, torque wrenches, a caliper, feeler gauge, a tusk valve installation and removal tool, some wire, rags, gloves, and safety glasses, and a copy of your OEM service manual for more information, proper procedures, and specs. For parts, we offer a wide variety of OEM and aftermarket parts for what you need. Today we're going to be using a combination of OEM and aftermarket parts to do this job. Now we also offer a wide variety of tools and specialty tools so that you can do the job right. First, we need to start with a clean machine. You don't want dirt getting into anything that you don't want dirt to get into. Next, we'll disconnect the battery, followed by the seat, the plastics, and the fuel tank. Now let's disconnect the crankcase hose and remove the airbox and the airbox intake. Now let's remove the carburetor cable and carburetor. Next, let's remove the fuel tank tray and exhaust. Now let's remove the spark plug cap and clean any area needed so that we don't drop any dirt into the motor once we expose it. Now would be a good time to drain our oil. If you need more information on that, check out our oil change video on a TRX400EX. Now let's go ahead and remove our upper oil return line, our engine mount, and our intake manifold. Now you can obviously see that this motor has been ingesting dirt. Now with further inspection of our intake manifold, you can see that the rubber is peeling away from the mount. And we noticed a crack right here on the bottom outside, and then there's also a crack on the inside. So obviously we've been allowing dirt to come in there into the motor. Now let's remove the spark plug, the valve cover caps, along with the timing plugs, and find top dead center compression. An easy way to find that is if you rotate the motor over until the intake valves open. Now, once you rotate it another quarter turn or so, they'll close and you should see the F and then the T mark, T being for top dead center compression. Now, it's always a good idea to inspect your parts as you're pulling it off, like your intake boot or checking your valve clearance. This stuff will help you once you tear down your engine to find out what exactly all is going on. Now let's remove the valve cover, breaking all of our bolts a quarter turn, starting in the center and working our way out in a crisscross pattern. Now be careful when doing this not to drop the dowel pins. Ours stayed in the head, so let's go ahead and pull those out. Now let's break our cam gear bolt loose, rotate it over and break the other one loose. Then we want to remove the cam chain tensioner and remove both bolts. Now when you're doing the tensioner, you can use a small flat blade screwdriver. I've got this special tool that you can purchase where it will hold the cam tensioner disengaged while you remove it and install it. Now if you don't have this tool and you have a thin flat blade screwdriver, you can go ahead and insert that and back off the tensioner that way, but keep in mind you're going to have to hold that while you loosen the mounting bolts to remove the whole tensioner. Just be careful not to drop these down into the motor. Now we can drop the cam gear off of the cam and remove the cam. Now before you go any further, let's go ahead and remove the plunger and spring right here. Just be careful not to drop them down into the motor. Now before we remove the cam chain gear off of the chain, let's grab some wire and we'll go ahead and wire up our chain just so that we don't drop it down into the motor. So remove the gear, get your wire, and when you do this, just make sure you can unattach it from wherever you're tying it off to a couple of times, because as we're going to have to do that as we pull the head off and the cylinder. Now let's remove the cam locating dowel pins. Make sure not to drop them down into the motor. Now let's break loose our cylinder head nuts using a 1/4 turn, then we'll do that in a crisscross pattern and remove them. Now let's remove the nuts and washers. Just make sure not to drop them down in the motor as well. Now let's remove the head. It's a tight fit, so just take your time and make sure not to drop your dowel pins as well. Next, let's remove the chain slider and break all of our cylinder bolts loose a 1/4 turn and then remove them in a crisscross pattern. Don't forget to get the cylinder bolt washers as well. Now let's remove the cylinder. Just be careful not to let the piston drop and hit the side of the case and damage it. Don't lose your dowel pins as well. Now let's remove the piston, but before we do that, let's shove some rags down into the crankcase so that it holds the rod from damaging the case, 1, and 2, we don't drop a circlip down in the case. Now you can use a pick or a small screwdriver and pick out the circlip. Now we'll just slide the piston pin out and remove the piston. It's always a good idea to stay clean and organized. This will help you with your inspection process and with your reassembly process. Now that we have our top end removed, we need to start the inspection process and work up a parts list so that we know what parts we need to get before we do our reassembly. We need to inspect the crank rod, make sure that there's no heavy galling or anything like that. If there is, we'll definitely need to dig further and replace that. The other thing we want to look for is side-to-side play and up and down. You want absolutely no up and down play. You do need a little side-to-side play, and there is a feeler gauge spec that you can stick in between the crank cheek and the rod to measure that. The other thing you want to check is just the mating surface of the cases themselves. You need to check the cam chain guide. And the last thing is the cam chain. Now what you're looking for here is just complete free movement. You want to make sure that it doesn't get hung up on itself. If it does, then you'll definitely need to replace it. And you can look at the inside where your cam gear teeth go, and you'll also need to inspect your upper gear at the teeth and see if there's any excess of wear there. But for the most part, they don't wear out too fast, but it's something you definitely need to be aware of. Now let's inspect our piston and cylinder. Now what we want to look for on our piston is just the overall wear. Do our rings move freely? Kind of the condition that they are in as you see them on the piston. You want to look at the skirt and see what kind of wear is there, whether there's vertical scratches, gouging, or even parts that are chipped off a piston. Now this in particular engine was ingesting a lot of dirt, and you can see a lot of that burnt here on top of the piston. Now because it was ingesting a lot of dirt, it prematurely wore out the piston rings, which then allowed it to start burning oil. It still ran, but it started burning oil, and it was just progressively getting worse. So that right there is a good indicator of why you would want to replace your piston and freshen up your top end. Now if we take a look at the piston pin, what we want to look for there is where the pin sat inside the piston. Obviously inside the piston on this one, it looks in pretty good shape. The pin itself has obviously got some discoloration. Now there's no heavy grooving. If it were to have heavy grooving, you would definitely need to replace it, but chances are you'd probably also need to replace your crankshaft rod as well. So that's something to look for. And then obviously we can measure things out and see that if they're within spec. Now on the cylinder, what you want to look for there is, let's start in the bore with the crosshatch. Now down here on the bottom, it's definitely apparent that you can see it. And up here where your rings were wearing against the cylinder wall, it's less apparent. Now dirt obviously sped that process up and smoothed it out. So it definitely needs to be repaired there. Now the other things that you can look for is your base gasket. This one runs an O-ring around your cylinder skirt, so make sure that you replace that when you do this. Now the last thing you need to look for is where your cylinder head mates with your cylinder. You can take a look at your head gasket. Sometimes that will tell you some indicators of a failure, but you ultimately want to make sure that it's flat. You can remove all your studs and use a machinist straight edge and measure that to see what your warpage is at. And all these measurements for your piston and your cylinder are all in your OEM service manual, so make sure to check out those specs when you're measuring this out. Now we have a good video on how to measure your cylinder and your piston clearance, so make sure to check that out as well. Now on this motor, it did have a slight oil leak through the head gasket, which brings me to, it's not a bad idea to inspect your head gasket. Sometimes it'll give you some indications on what's going on with your motor. Now this one did have a slight oil leak, which the gasket's not really telling us that much that way, but if you were to have a liquid cooled motor, a lot of times it can tell you whether you were leaking coolant or not, if you were burning it, if you were losing some compression through it. So it's just something to check out while you're doing your inspection. Now once you've inspected your gaskets, don't ever reuse your gaskets. Next, we need to inspect our head, but before we do that, we need to remove all of our valves and valve springs. So let's go ahead and take our valve spring remover tool, and we'll go ahead and remove those. Now to do that, you need one side of the tool to sit right inside the cup of the valve, and on the other side, we'll use this to fit right over top of your valve spring retainer, and it will press down on the retainer and expose your keepers, and then you can pull those out with a magnet. Now as you're doing this, just make sure to be careful. If the tool starts binding on you, you might need to back it off and readjust it and try again. Just be careful not to lose the keepers, and you want to keep well organized and keep all of your parts together as they wear together, so just keep that in mind. Now we need to remove the valve seal, and we also need to remove the valve spring seat. Now on some motors, the valve spring seat won't even come off unless you remove the seal. This one, it will. Now we'll just repeat this process on all the other three. Now remember, always keep your parts organized as they wear together. This will also help with inspection and the reassembly process. Now that we've got those removed, let's go ahead and start with the cylinder head itself first. Now, if you need to clean your parts before you inspect, that's always a good idea. I've already seen one thing on here that tells me that we need to replace it anyway, so I'm not going to spend too much time cleaning it. What we want to inspect there is the mating surface between the cylinder head and the cylinder. You want to look for any irregularities there, and then you also want to get a machinist edge and a feeler gauge and check for warpage. Now these specs are in your manual that you can check on, so make sure to check those out. Now let's look at the valve seats themselves. Now these are actually in pretty decent shape. It looks like they've been sealing pretty decent. The exhaust, they've got a little buildup in there, but that could clean up. You could send it off to a machine shop and have those recut. Now we have got a good video on cylinder head rebuild, so check that out if you need more information on that. Next we want to inspect our cam journals. Now these are actually in pretty bad shape. Now we're going to go ahead and replace this head because that's way out of spec. But Most of the time they're fairly smooth, but that's definitely something you want to check, and it corresponds with your valve cover as well. You can't have that machined and you can't have it repaired. And keep in mind that the valve cover and head aren't sold separately. They are a machined pair specific to this head. Now let's move on to the valve guides. Now what you want to look for there, sometimes they'll crack at the top. Any sort of physical damage that you can see, obviously you're going to want to replace the guide itself. Now if you have the tool to measure the inner diameter of the valve guide, like this one, install that and it expands out, and then you use your caliper to measure the width of this, and that's how you'd get the overall inner diameter. Now we can refer to our service manual for the spec on that. Now we can measure the diameter of our valve stem. Now you want to do that in multiple spots to get an overall reading. Now you simply just take the reading from your valve guide and the reading from your valve stem and subtract them from each other, and that should give you the number. Now there will be a wear limit, and if it's within that wear limit, you could potentially continue to use the valves that are in it, just as long as the rest of it checks out. Now the last thing on the cylinder head, just an overall look of it. Sometimes you'll see hairline cracks in places, and obviously if it's cracked, then you would just need to replace it, so just keep that in mind. Now let's move to the valve cover. Now the valve cover has a lot of moving parts. You got a number of rocker arms that ride on pins. Now if any one of them are getting hung up on each other, that's something you definitely want to replace. Now on this rocker arm, this pad in particular has worn away a lot. Now you can see here with this camshaft journal that it's in good shape. Now that's kind of irrelevant because we have to replace the head and they come as a matched pair. Now the other thing you want to look for is the rocker arm tips. Now this rocker arm rests against this rocker arm, which then rests against the top of your valve. Now you can get some wear there, so keep that in mind. And then obviously an overall look for cracks or irregularities there. Now our conclusion with the cylinder head inspection is, based on the cam journal, the rocker arm pad, and the camshaft, they're all out of spec. So we're going to go ahead and replace those. Now anytime that you have a part that's used that is still within spec, go ahead and reuse it. If not, then you definitely need to replace it. Out of all the years that I've been doing this, you're always better off to replace it with a new part than try to get the life out of a used part. Now let's talk about the camshaft. What you want to look for is the overall condition. You want to check where the camshaft rides in the journals. You want to check the cam lobes. You're definitely going to want to measure those and refer to your OEM service manual for the spec in there to see if they're still within spec and reusable. And then any sort of discoloration. There's a little bit of discoloration on the bearing here. It's not too bad, not too concerned with that. But the main part on this camshaft is the exhaust lobe has taken a lot of wear. Now I've removed this exhaust rocker arm out of the head so you could see better, and I've got a brand new one right here so that you can see the comparison of the two. The rocker arm definitely has worn a lot more away than the camshaft has, but they both definitely need to be replaced. Next, let's move to our valve assembly. We want to inspect each valve stem and the seat of the valve. Now, 400EXs use steel valves. There's a lot of machines out there that use titanium valves. You're more likely to be able to reuse steel valves as they don't wear near as quick as a titanium valve, so just keep that in mind. We're also going to look at the valve spring seat. These generally don't wear very much at all, and then we want to measure and see what the free length of our valve springs are. Over time they get weak or they can possibly break, so you definitely want to measure them and see if they're still within spec and replace them as needed. Now the next thing you want to check is the valve spring retainer. These generally don't wear very much either. Now the valve keepers, on the other hand, they can show a fair amount of wear. You can reuse them. They're really inexpensive. You're probably better off just to replace them unless you're reusing the valve, because they've actually already worn together. But if you are replacing the valve, just go ahead and replace them as well. Now the last thing we want to look at while we're at the valve keepers is the tip of the valve. Now the rocker arms that are on this machine, they tend to wear a groove in the top of the valve. If that gets bad enough, you'll definitely want to replace that. Now with the cam chain tensioner, you want to look at the overall condition. You want to check out the tip here and then the overall function of it, meaning you want it to work very smoothly and not get hung up when you extend and retract it. Now that we've inspected our parts, we need to work up our parts list. I like to use our website as a tool by entering my machine in there and seeing what is available with the aftermarket parts. Then I'll go to the OEM diagram and go through and get the individual parts that I need from that as well. Now that we've got our parts list put together, let's go ahead and clean all the parts that we're reusing and get everything ready for the assembly process. This is part 1 of our TRX400EX top-end rebuild. Make sure to check out our other videos in this series for the reassembly process.